Welcome to Revelations with Erin Pizzey. On this show, we will be exploring the issues faced by men and boys everywhere. We will be sharing our perspectives and your own. Your host, Erin Pizzey, was born in 1939 in China while her father was stationed there as a member of the British Foreign Office. In 1971, Erin opened the first ever domestic violence refuge for battered women and children in Chiswick, England. What she found, however, was that many of the women coming into her shelter were as violent as the men they were freeing. Over the years, she also tried to create resources and safe spaces for men as well as women, but frequently met with indifference and hostility to men suffering. Nevertheless, it's a passion she continues to hold to this day for men, for women, and especially for children.
For so many years, feminists have been able to demonize men under their artificial arguments called patriarchy. Hi, I'm Erin Pizzey, and through working with battered women in my refuges, I saw for myself how family violence is passed on from one generation to the next. Quite simply, violent behavior experienced in childhood is often carried forward into adult relationships. Family violence is not a gender issue and never was. It's a generational issue. To my amazement, nobody ever wanted to hear why violent people treat each other the way they do. Instead, feminists have had people believe that men are responsible for all the violence in our society. There is sufficient evidence that both men and women can be equally violent in their personal relationships, but for many years, men and boys have been held to ransom and have been made to live in the knowledge that they are dispensable and shamed. There is an enormous job ahead of us, but my hope is that the 21st century will see men and women standing shoulder to shoulder and working together to actively take on the feminists and to show everyone that domestic violence is not and never has been a gender issue.
The truth is that men and boys are not privileged in our society, but are often marginalized, disadvantaged and ignored. We will be inviting you to call in and discuss your views and your experiences. Anyone of any age, sex, sexual orientation or religious background is invited to call in and talk. We may not get to everyone, but we will do our best within the show's allotted time. If you do wish to call in to share your own experiences, you will probably want to keep things on a first-name basis. You may wish to use a pseudonym for yourself or family members so that there's no concern about privacy. Welcome to Revelations with Erin Pizzey and her co-host, Ian Esme. The truth is often painful to hear, but in truth there is hope, and we hope you will stick around to hear it.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the latest episode of Revelations with Erin Pizzey. I'm Erin's co-host, Dean Esme. Say good morning to everybody, or afternoon to everybody, Erin.
Hello, everybody. It's raining and winding and miserable in London today.
Isn't that what London is supposed to be like this time of year?
No. We have irascible weather.
I get you there. I understand you'll be leaving London soon, won't you, Erin?
Yeah, our next show will be me. I will be in LA for 2.5 months. I'll be talking to you from there. I'm very much looking forward to it.
I mean, you're going to have a very busy schedule when you finally get here to the States, too. I'd like to let everybody know in advance, remind everybody that we do have a show here every Saturday at the same time on alternating weekends. Erin's show is every other Saturday, and then in the intervening episodes we have Tales from the Infrared, our show on geek culture by with Christian Shaston and myself and a few others. This show is our more serious show where we discuss serious issues like domestic violence and quite a few other related topics. In any case today, that will be our topic, domestic violence in specific and related issues. And we are honored today to be joined by Professor Don Dutton, who is a professor of psychology at the University of British Columbia up in Canada. Good morning, Professor Dutton. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Good morning.
Thank you so much for joining us. Now, it's very interesting because Erin has been after me for months to track down and invite Professor Dutton onto the show, and I finally got around to it. And I was a little taken aback when I first saw the very first publications I saw by Professor Dutton. I think they go back to the 70s, because they seemed, at least from the titles, to be all about men's violence towards women. And I thought, well, of course that there is such a thing as men's violence toward women, but the initial impression I got just from that flash look was, oh, he's another one of those who think this is primarily a male-on-female problem when we're discussing male domestic violence. However, deeper reading and deeper looking made it clear, for one thing, he is the author of Rethinking Domestic Violence. That's the book, Rethinking Domestic Violence, which is published by UBC Press. The last edition was put out in 2006. And Professor Dutton, from what I understand, since you started in the 70s, your views have changed considerably over what the basic nature of domestic violence is. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, that would be a fair assessment, although I will say I never completely got into the gender explanation of domestic violence, even in the early days.
So you were questioning it from the beginning, and for you the early days would be, what, the mid-70s?
Yeah, really. I mean, I was interested in it as a psychological phenomenon, not really as a socio-political phenomenon, which is the way it's cast by the gender paradigm.
Okay, yeah, you refer to something called the gender paradigm. Let's just clarify for the audience, although I suspect most of our listeners already know, maybe you're new to this. The gender paradigm is, would it be fair to state, that domestic violence is primarily men exerting their need to control and dominate women and subjugate women and their children, and that this is the primary means or primary vector through which domestic violence happens, that it's all about men's control of women, men's control of children, men's need to be patriarchal and dominated, and so on. That would pretty much be the gender paradigm. Am I describing that fairly?
Yeah, that's correct. The paradigm is really a lens for looking at the world, looking at any social phenomenon and explaining it. The gender paradigm does it the way you just described. It looks at all domestic violence as though it were a socio-political problem, a sort of reassertion of patriarchy happening within individual couples. Of course, we know that it's far more complex than that, and that's only true in a very small percentage of the time. But that was the one sort of stereotypical view that was handed out in the gender paradigm.
Now, you're not suggesting that there are no cases of men who are, for want of a better word, patriarchally controlling and use violence. You're not suggesting they don't exist, right?
No, they exist, but they're maybe, the way it's been defined in the literature, it's maybe 5% of all domestic violence.
5%? 5%
it would be repeat use of violence to dominate a woman that's being done along socio-political lines for reasons that the man has expectations that he should be the boss of the household. It's maybe about 5%.
And I guess this will lead to the other question, and I'll let Eric say something about this. I wonder what percentage of it is from women who are attempting to exert dominance and control. What percentage would you think that is?
Well, I mean, I can say a few things about that. I mean, there have been 5 large sample surveys done in the U.S., and well, the earliest one being very starts the survey in 1989, but the other ones all being more recent, 2006, 2007. And we're talking about a sort of accumulated total here of maybe 10,000 people. And so they all get to report on whether domestic violence has happened to them and whether they perpetrated it or not. It's important that you ask both those questions about victimization and perpetration, not just one. And when you ask both those questions, what you find out is half of all domestic violence is two-way bilateral violence matched for level of severity. And of the remaining half, 70% of the remaining half, i.e. 35% of all domestic violence, is women using violence against non-violent males. the remaining percentage, 15%, is males using violence against nonviolent females. But of course, about 2/3 violence will only be things like pushing and shoving, won't be anything more serious than that. And so, you know, the sort of stereotypical view of the guy beating her up, wife battering, of course, everything that's suggested by that term battering, gets down to at most 5%, according to these surveys. But of course, that's the one view that's being offered up by the media, and in a lot of cases, then by the gender paradigm.
And the media and governments, I'm sorry to say. Now you just said something a little provocative here, but so if I just heard your numbers correctly, you just suggested that women are actually more likely to start with the hitting.
Well, not to start. I mean, there are some questions to that who struck first. They're more likely to use violence against a nonviolent male than the reverse, male to use violence against nonviolent females. They're about twice as frequent.
Can I just
It's your show, Erin. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say, Don, well, to me, obviously, because I'm not an academic and I have no degrees, all I have is sort of street experience. So when I took in the first women, the first 100 that came in, we sat down and did questionnaires together. And of the first 100 that came in, 62 were violent or more violent than the men they left.
Right.
The other, what was left, were women who were innocent victims of their partner's violence. They hadn't come from violent backgrounds. They, by accident, had got involved with a violent man.
Right.
The women that most mattered, and the women that I, in the end, took care of, were the women who had actually histories of violence in their own background. They were the ones that were violent to men, to the children, and repeat violent relationships. So I, from the very beginning, stopped worrying about the figures of how many men hit, how many women hit. The question is, how many and what happened to you as a child? And if you were born and marinated in violence in the womb and then born into a violent family, you will develop strategies of survival, I used to call it. And many, the only strategy they ever learn in those families is violence, so they go on to repeat patterns. So all the other arguments actually fall by the wayside, because we've got to stop the war, the gender war, because until we stop it, we can't heal it.
Right. Well, I mean, that's absolutely right. I mean, and of course, the research evidence doesn't support the gender paradigm at all. It's only a very small percentage of men or women in any society that's been sampled, i.e. Western societies, that approve of using violence to hit their partner. It's like 2% in the U.S. of men and 1.8% of women. So there's no acceptance for this at all. Secondly, if you look within any demographic group, any racial group or socioeconomic group or whatever, it's only somewhere around 12% at most of people in that group who ever use domestic violence. So you're always looking at a minority of every demographic group. And if you're finding a minority coming up all the time, then there's going to be other factors going on, more of a sort of psychological nature that probably have origins in the family of origin, the way you described it. It differentiates that small group who's using it from the larger group who doesn't use it within that demographic category.
You know, John, I'm particularly interested in talking to you because when I last saw you, we were with Senator Ann Coles, and she was running a refuge in the very early days.
Yes.
You know, my mother was Canadian, and she was violent and abused as a child. And I particularly wanted to ask you about the history, because if I got this right, that the reason why Canada, of all countries in the world that I've been to, the Western world particularly, is the most frightening in terms of the feminist, what would you call it, the rule of the feminist fist in a country like yours, to where they've created new criminal offences, and they've expanded any kind of sexual behaviour to where virtually your universities are hostile places towards young men. How did all this begin? How did they get that power? How did they get funded to have so much power?
Well, you know, it was a matter of sort of influence, I guess, in the early days and how things developed sort of socioeconomically. I mean, there were a number of sort of strange events that happened here. For example, when domestic violence as a problem was first offered up in the House of Commons, the media sort of portrayed the fact that quote, some honorable members were laughing. Well, we don't know what they're laughing about, but that sort of really hit the fan, and obviously especially laughing at domestic violence. And it just kind of, I don't know why it came through more strongly in Canada, but it was an issue. And the way it was sort of portrayed, of course, is domestic violence equals women's rights. So that really appealed to the left. And then to the right, it was, well, domestic violence really equals family values. That really appealed to the right. And there was no opposition, just no opposition. Anybody who would say anything about the gender paradigm was somehow labeled as being anti-female or in favor of domestic violence. Some ridiculous argument would be made. I mean, I still get that. I get that in academic papers where people criticize me for being against women's rights because I talk about what the data say. I mean, I don't know why Canada is more extreme, but it's pretty extreme. You're right.
Well, I think one of the answers may be that apparently, this is talking to Anne, Pierre Trudeau put in a huge amount of money towards women's movements and women's organizations. And you have a huge amount of women in positions of great power now. Yeah. And I think the thing that frightens me, particularly on university campuses, is that so many of the radical feminist women are chancellors and vice chancellors and whatever in your universities. And it's their actual radical feminist politics to get rid of men.
Yeah, and well, I mean, there's no question that there's a lot of power. I mean, if you start saying anything against it, you really are persona non grata, as I am to a certain extent.
Mr. Dutton, now, if I have it right, you have tenure, right? And you're a professor, so you're probably not in a great deal of danger, at least of losing your career.
Well, no, wait.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I was going to say, Don, when I met you, there are other ways of making people who say the things that anger the feminists. There are other ways of implicating them in things they haven't done. Yeah?
Yes, absolutely.
And they're very, very frightening because you have kangaroo courts where you are.
Mm-hmm. Well, the point I was going to make is that while Professor Dutton's actual career isn't necessarily under threat, he's not going to lose his job. I was going to ask, have there been other instances where you've published the peer-reviewed literature? I mean, I want our audience to know this the professor of psychology. Professor Dutton has published in the peer-review literature. He's a scientist, not just a guy giving you his opinion because he's got a psychology degree. And he's published in the peer-reviewed literature. He says, and I wanted to ask you, can you tell us more about it? You just said you have received some harassment, some sniping, some nastiness.
I think the strangest thing is, I told you about one case where I'd been asked to give a talk in Chicago, and it was really about spousal homicide and predictive models. And I basically, first of all, I didn't want to do it. Finally, I agreed to do it, so I sent them a PowerPoint where I was sort of arguing that predictive models for spousal homicide were not very good because they were just focusing on one person, i.e. the subsequent perpetrator, and who might become that perpetrator. And if you actually looked at it from a couple's perspective, the prediction might be better. Well, they canceled the talk 24 hours later. I mean, the other thing for me, of course, has been from time to time, I'll just give you one example. When we did a survey way back in the 80s here in Alberta to look at incidents of domestic violence, and when a colleague of mine, we submitted a proposal to do the same thing nationally, and we thought at the time it was a pretty innovative study. It had never been done here, et cetera, et cetera. And to our surprise, we got turned down, and then the study we proposed was done, but it only asked women about their victimization, whereas our proposal had asked both men and women about both victimization and perpetration. So you wonder about things like that. I mean, you can't ever prove what would happen, but if that's happening systematically, you start to wonder about it.
I was wondering, Tom, how are we going to move the discussion forward that can actually turn the entire subject away from patriarchy, which, as far as I'm concerned, has been a huge fraud. It's been a method of funding feminist institutions. It's $1 billion industry. How is it that we can actually use all the research we have to prove that violence has never been gendered? It is a generational family problem that has been with us forever, and that we need to begin studying the roots of violence and end all the research on how many men, how many women, etc., etc., etc. Have you any ideas?
Well, you know, I don't have any brilliant ideas. I mean, to me, it's a matter of getting the truth out to the broadest number of people, and that usually involves media programs like this one. I mean, I know, for example, you know, that I have access to large college classes, but I don't know what positions of influence these kids are ever going to wind up in. I know they're absolutely stunned when I show them the actual data on domestic violence. I mean, they sit there with their jaws hanging open. You can't, both the men and the women in the class, they absolutely just can't believe it. And they're in shock because they've got this brainwashed view of what domestic violence is, and when they actually see the data, it's stunning to them. But I mean, getting that out is difficult because, you know, I start my class off by showing them a piece that was written in our local newspaper, Vancouver Sun, by a columnist here, and she just did the absolute gender paradigm view on things. She took 3 really extreme cases of violence against women and then paired them with inflated statistics about domestic violence, and, you know, the whole thing's a propaganda piece, really. That's what the media are presenting people with repeatedly. So you have to somehow get into that and turn it around. And I don't exactly know how to do it, just being an academic.
Okay. Actually, it's only just to do with whether you're an academic or not. When I look across England, and I see that you have the feminized institutions, for instance, our courts, and yours are worse than ours, I think, and our secret family court, and we have all the social services, we have all publishing, because so many of the editors are radical editors. I have personal experience with that, of my editor saying, I hate your writing, I hate your books, I don't want to publish you. She had to in those days because my book sold, but I refused to write miserable, man-hating novels. And you get punished for that, you get bankrupted actually, and all your books taken out of the shops. You see, for 40 years, virtually nobody has been any kind of a stumbling block to these radical feminists. They've got away, and literally, you can say they've got away with murder, because they've totally ignored the figures for suicide for men. They've ignored the men who are also killed by their partners. And it is so deeply ensconced now, I don't know how we're going to change it. And I'm looking for ideas.
Solve it all for us right now, Professor. I'm not being sarcastic, seriously, but it's a huge, huge issue. And I think the only solution is to keep doing what we're doing on A Voice for Men and with this show and other shows like it. The cracks in the armor are showing, I can tell you that. It seems to be. I mean, I remember when I spoke to Professor Dutton a few days before the show, and he won't be mad at me for revealing that he's recently turned 70. And when he told me that, I had I don't know if I would call it a rational or irrational, but I was immediately angered to hear that. Not because I'm mad at him for being his age, but I'm like, why is there anything radical about this at this stage in this man's career, or Erin's career, if that matter? I mean, hasn't the data on this been pretty clear for a few decades now? I mean, I know it's got more and more refined, but has it been? Why is any of this radical?
Well, I think it's a comment on how twisted things have become. You're labeled a radical if you're showing people what the data say, and i.e. what the empirical evidence says. And when that becomes a radical position, then you know we're in trouble.
You see, one of the problems is where you have President Obama, who is feminist, and what he says, and our Prime Minister, who also calls single-parent mothers honourable and men sexless.
David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, who's a conservative, by the way, Tory, also recently declared himself a feminist, in case anybody cares. Come on there, Erin.
I'm just going to say, when it's at the top echelons, and it's certainly true of America, essentially will not take any action against the lies and the tragedies that have happened because of the lies and the state of young men in their countries, state of fathers who have been dragged out illegally from their homes, the fact that men have lost their human right to be innocent before they're proven guilty. This is all going on a daily basis. But nobody seems to care enough in any of the positions of power, because all of them, to be honest, they're frightened of the radical feminists. They're frightened of the power of the vote of these women. That's what I think.
Well, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I think that somehow the simplistic notion has carried today that domestic violence is equivalent to an assault on women's rights. And so anybody who moves in any way to make a domestic violence program more sophisticated, you can move it up a level to, let's see what the data say, it's sort of automatically lambasting against women's rights. And as I said, I mean, I've had academics come out in print and say I was against women's rights because I was talking about what the data said. So long as we've got that simplistic thinking, it's pretty hard to make any headway.
It looks like that we have a caller on hold who I think we want to get through. I believe this is Attila Vinzer from Toronto. Let me double check and see if I actually do have him. Attila, is that you, sir?
Yes, it is. Good afternoon, Professor Erin, and I'm happy to be here today.
Attila is the Canadian News Director for Voice for Men, amongst other things, and I know that Attila is planning some sort of domestic violence symposium in, I believe, May. Would you like to tell us a little more about that, Attila?
Yes, that is correct. I will tell you, about 3 years ago, I was invited to a domestic violence symposium put on by the Children's Aid Societies of Ontario. And I was absolutely appalled to the point that I almost stood up and screamed at the doctor that was the keynote speaker, because he was essentially showing pictures of men shooting the heads off of women with blood and gore, that this is the typical male, and this is what males do to women, and we need to deal with it, and domestic violence is this kind of an issue. I listened to both Erin and the professor speak. Am I still connected here?
Yes, sir, you are. We hear you.
Thank you. I just heard a click. I may have been disconnected. And I've heard the question put forward, or the thought, what can we do? What we need to do is to continue to do what we're doing to bring information to the public. I, too, have been attacked tremendously. In fact, recently at one of our events, people have wished me to be boiled in acid and burnt in a fire because I just simply stated that men and boys are in crisis. And the thing is, I was at a store just the other day. A young 17-year-old boy came up to me and said, "Are you still Vinzer?" I said, "Yes." And I was wondering how he knew me. He said, "I was at the Queen's Park rally, and I brought my mother there, and I was so shocked, and it was unbelievable, the information that you guys put forward." So one, the fact that we're talking about it is effective, and we need to continue to bring this information to our members of parliament. We need to bring this information to the media. And I will tell you, in the short 8-year period that I've been advocating for the rights of children and families, I have seen a change. I am seeing media actually reporting and taking some risk in reporting. I will tell you that years ago, they refused to even talk about it because they would be immediately attacked by these feminists. And why are they attacking? They are attacking because by actually acknowledging the truth about domestic violence, we are taking away 50% of their potential funding, because it is a multi-billion-dollar-a-year industry in Ontario alone. So you can imagine across Canada and the world what kind of money this is. And this is all taxpayers' money that is being paid into these domestic violence shelters, these women's violence against women's organizations. It's incredible amounts of money. So the event that we're having here in Toronto in May, I made a decision the day that I was at the event put on by the Children's Aid Society, which was incredibly wrong, with incredible misinformation. I made a decision that I would host a domestic violence symposium in Toronto to actually, not to counter that event, but to bring unabated, factual reality to what domestic violence is. And for those who are wondering, domestic violence is not a woman's issue. It is a family issue. Domestic violence impacts and affects men, women, children, and even other family members and relatives. That's what domestic violence can possibly be. But the bigger problem that I have with it all in total is that men have been grossly vilified with the stigma that any man out there on the street, at the schools, walking around is a potential rapist, a pedophile, or someone that has the intent or the capacity to wish harm upon a child or a woman, or I should say woman, and that is just entirely wrong. And lastly, I'm going to share the effect of what all of this is having on our society. My 13-year-old son told me the other day that at school, a grade 1 girl, so 6 years old, for absolutely no reason, walked up to him in front of his friends, slapped him across the face, and said, you are not allowed to hit girls, and you cannot hit me back because you're a boy.
I'm going to ask or bring something. We've spent a good bit of time bashing on the feminists here, and I will go ahead and add a qualifier that the feminists we're talking about are those in political power, in charge of various departments, organizations, etc. I'm quite certain there may be women or even men sitting there listening to this who are like, what are you talking about? I don't see any of this money. I'm just a feminist because I believe in equality. We're not talking about you, although if you don't recognize that there's a problem with people who have this control of this funding, then you kind of are part of the problem if you don't at least acknowledge that this is going on. But I'd also like to get to something that Professor Dutton said a few minutes ago that I personally never miss an opportunity to point out. While we might say that feminist ideology has been the driving force behind this idea that domestic violence is primarily a male-on-female problem or a male-toward-children problem. But I find that conservative-minded, traditionalist, whatever you want to call it, I have found that they are the people, even if they're quick to accept that this is some sort of family values issue, that men are big and brutal, and it seems like your Tories, your conservatives are complicit in at least not saying something. You think I'm wrong about that, guys?
I don't think you're wrong. Go ahead.
Okay. I just want to say that one of the major problems internationally with men is their attitude towards women, because largely for most men are very chivalrous towards women, and particularly towards their mothers. One of the hardest things I ever have to do is when I'm dealing with a violent family, everybody in the family, girls and boys, will discuss their father's violence. The boys very, very, very reluctantly will say anything about what the mother does. And I do think that's a major problem, actually.
What do you think?
Well, I think the problem with, the right, I agree with you that, that's been any sort of correction that's come. We've got a conservative government in Canada, and they haven't done anything to correct things. And I think for them, the issue is, they see domestic violence as a family rights issue, but they still see the man as the main problem. So in that whole sort of interplay, that whole sort of pattern within the family, where there can be problems with alcoholism or substance abuse or interracial problems between the mother and father and them and the children, they pick out this one interaction, which is the man being violent to his wife, as being the one that they put all the weight on. So they don't really correct the left-wing view that it's being done to support patriarchy, but they still see it as the main issue. So I don't really see there's any political support from the left or the right.
I would tend to agree with the
women who are really violent and violent to their children are without any kind of help, because if the radical feminist attitude, which is all women are innocent victims of men's violence, it leaves the women who are violent and to their children in a terrible place because nothing's happening to help them. Usually what happens is their children are taken away and they very quickly replace them. We do have to have a sane discussion about family violence that does not demonize the father?
Well, I know, just for an example, I mean, I agree with that completely. And, it went so far as years ago that I took on the website of the American Bar Association because it had what they called 10 myths of domestic violence, and it usually were all the ones that doesn't happen, blah, 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 and it replaced them all with a paradigm view. But the evidence for every new answer they came up with was dubious, to say the most. So, I mean, I just basically published an academic paper that just showed how wrong they were being, and it was just the same thing again. I mean, you can only sort of take these things on one by one, I think, and I sort of do what I can. My position on this has always been to take a social science position. That's to say, look, if we base policy on something, it should be on the best available evidence. This goes to what the police do, what the criminal justice system does, and whether or not it should even be a criminal justice issue all the time, or whether there's other better ways to handle it. And it should also impact on treatment. It should also impact on custody assessments, all these things. But it's not right now. It's all being driven by gender paradigm dogma.
But that's what makes it so dangerous, because there are new criminal laws now in rape, for example. There's a hysterical attitude among the radical feminists towards the whole concept of rape. And anything can be rape now. From somebody gets kissed who didn't want to get kissed, that can be called rape, and therefore can be made into a criminal offence. There's a young man at a university that I'm in touch with. He was accused by a girlfriend after a night of sex with her of raping her against her will, and was kicked off out of his university. I'm not going to tell you which one, because this is still fragile. It's the police, actually, who backed him. And finally, the university had to take him back. And you look at this, and it's happening all the way across all the academic universities in the Western world. And so, now we've reached the same position with domestic violence. There can be absolutely no violence. There can be a raised voice. There can be a threat. That's also domestic violence. But the penalties are just as severe. Mm-hmm. So we have a whole new raft of anti-male laws that are taking away men's rights, and nothing's stopping it.
I have a question for Professor Dutton, and it's going to be involving his grad students, because I assume he has them. But first, I noticed we have another caller who's been waiting a while, Al from Atlanta, who apparently has some ideas he would like to share with us about getting information out to the public. Al from Atlanta, are you there? Did we lose you, Al? Hello? Looks like we lost Al from Atlanta. Okay, I do apologize. I'll come back to my other question then. What are you seeing? Okay, you mentioned you teach students, and their jaws tend to drop when you tell them what the statistics actually look like, Professor Dutton. I assume you have grad students working under you, working to get their masters and their PhDs?
Yes.
Are you finding they are, and maybe this is a delicate subject, I don't know, are you finding they are having difficulty in their careers just for associating with what you're talking about?
I haven't so far, but of course they don't all come out doing work on domestic violence, and they don't all come out necessarily tarnished by their association with me. It's interesting. I mean, a couple of years ago, I taught a graduate class, and it was, I would say, maybe 80% female, and we talked about sort of research methodology and what it said on domestic violence. There was absolutely no resistance in that class to sort of seeing what the research said, because these women are social scientists first, and I still was second. So there's no problem at all in there. But yeah, actually there's more of a problem in undergraduate classes where they don't have quite the same research sophistication, and they're sort of more steeped in the political model. So, I mean, that's part of the issue. No, I haven't found that people have been tainted. I mean, I've got a graduate student right now who's just looking for a place she's doing her master's, and she wants to do a doctorate. And, I'm kind of suggesting that she begin to work with some of the people that are doing research on women's violence. There are a small group of people who are doing that work now, including Denise Hines, who does great work at Clark University. So there's a few things like that are, sort of promising, I guess, new rays of hope.
Denise Hines would be somebody who'd be great for us to talk to, wouldn't she?
Vivian Hines. Really?
Vivian Hines. Yeah,
okay.
She's done great work. I mean, she did work on the men's domestic violence hotline that was set up in New Hampshire. She was the first person to start publishing data on battered men, men who, had been abused, physically abused, seriously physically abused, a lot of them injured, and men who tried to seek help. And, of course, the majority of them were told when they called the local domestic violence shelter that they were, in fact, the real batterer, even though they were calling in injured most of the time. So, I mean, her work has been really interesting, and she continues to publish it. And, of course, what happens is that, it turns out that these men sound very much like battered women back in the early 70s. They're getting hurt, and there's no help for them.
But you see the difference, the major difference is the moment the press discovered my little tiny refuge in Chivik and talked to the women coming in, there was an outcry of compassion and sympathy and pity, and money flowed in. And I opened a men's house not that much later. Nothing. Right. I couldn't get a tea for them.
Right, because men are supposed to be able to take care of themselves. That's basically the attitude. I mean, I did actually talk about a case here in Canada that was a real case, and I managed to get it written up in our national newspaper of a man who had a knife sticking in him and called 911 for help. And police came, and they took him to the hospital, got the knife out, and then arrested him for domestic violence.
Well, what on earth business does he have running into her knife like that?
Exactly. He must have done something to deserve it.
I'm being flip, and I hope the gentleman never hears this. He knows I'm not making fun of him. I'm being sarcastic because with the work that I do, with the work that Erin's done, we see it over and over and over again. I was just talking to a gentleman who woke up, sleeping on a sofa, woke up with his girlfriend on top of him, beating the living crap out of him. And, grabbed her arms and wrestled her away and, spend the night in jail for assaulting his girlfriend. This is a serious problem. And what's doubly funny about it to me is, first off, if we see men as human beings, we shouldn't be thinking of this violent woman's interests first. But I will make the point, and I bet you anything Erin will back me up, not doing this actually doesn't that sort of thing. Of course, the primary victim is the man who just got beat up and sent to jail for the crime of being beaten up. But even that violent woman, I would argue, is being harmed by a system that does this sort of thing too. Enables her to do this sort of thing because she's not addressing her own violent impulses, is she?
She doesn't. No. She's the victim, isn't she?
A victim. I won't say the. She's a secondary victim, but I would.
No, I mean, a system that's failing on a conceptual level is failing everybody. I mean, there's no question about that. I mean, in fact, studies that they've done, even if you just focus on violence to women as the sole objective of policy, things that like mandatory arrest just don't really do the trick the way they're currently set up. I mean, in U.S. states, the states that have mandatory arrest have higher spousal homicide rates towards women than the ones that didn't set up mandatory arrest. And one of the reasons some women stopped using the system because they didn't want their husband to be arrested. They just didn't like that. So, it's failing women and it fails men, obviously. Everybody gets failed by it because it's misconceptualized.
And at the end of the day, the real victims of all this are the children, because they are born into these families and they have, at least the adults have a choice of each other, even if it was a bad choice. But the children have no choice. They're born in, and essentially the only recourse, because there isn't a proper treatment program for either men or women. There's only this dreadful Duluth model, which is all to do with the patriarchy. Men have to confess and admit that they have a Y chromosome. The real treatment model has to be that these are already hideously battered children who have just grown up to repeat the pattern, and they need help to transcend their own violence. And that's what I did all those years and still do. Because it's in the transcending that you make the change.
And that's something that ought to be hopeful and ought to be talked about. I mean, Erin said something that struck me very strongly. I grew up in a violence and abusive background myself. And the odd thing was is that until I hit a certain age, I was not even conscious of my own mother's violence until I got significantly older. Now, I did not grow up to be a batterer, but I'm 47 years old, and only in the last few years have I come to grips with some of that stuff in my background. So I'm just going to concur, yeah, it is ultimately the children who are harmed, and we are perpetuating something here when we continue with this gendered model. Now, I have on hold, waiting for a while now, has been somebody else. I'm going to see if we can take this caller. John, are you there?
I am here, and thanks for taking my call, Dean. Hello to everyone.
John.
Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning. Question
Yes,
for
where I am. It's morning where I am.
Okay, morning where I am too in the United States.
In London.
Oh, good evening, then, Erin. It's nice to hear your voice again.
Hello. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Professor. I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned brainwashing earlier with the undergraduates when you presented them with the evidence. In your professional opinion, as someone who researches this subject thoroughly, I'm wondering how you think that they got brainwashed in the first place.
Well, I think it comes through the mass media, first of all. I mean, giving the example that I gave, which was our major newspaper here, which is presenting what amounts to a propaganda piece on domestic violence. I don't think they would do that on other topics, but there's absolutely nobody even bats an eyelash when they do it on domestic violence. So, I mean, the main message through the main media still is the gender paradigm. And then I think there's kind of a secondary socialization that spins off of that they kind of pick up as well, and just really nobody, well, very few, stand up and say, wait a minute, it's not like that. We're not really getting a contradictory or a point of view on this. It's just this one message. So you have a groupthink at a kind of mass level that's going on.
I have my own somewhat radical thought on this, which we can call it free association. I'm not going to back it up as science, although there may be some science that backs me up on this. I have a notion that human males have evolved an instinctive aversion to harming females and an instinctive urge to protect females. I'm not going to claim as a scientist to prove this, but I have a strong suspicion that it's true. And some of what we're up against in this area may just be that. Men especially they like to think of themselves as defending women, and they like to think women aren't like that. We may literally be fighting our own genetic programming sometimes on these sorts of things. And for as speculative as that is, I'll ask Professor Dutton for an opinion on it anyway.
Well, I mean, I think there is something to be said for the notion that males do have a protective instinct towards women and children. I mean, I think that is something that's sort of bred in. And in fact, Rich Felson in Pennsylvania has done some work that shows that males are actually far less violent in family relationships than they are outside the family, whereas the converse is true for women. So that would also go to your point. But I think, again, these things get spun by the media, and that is sort of the big input that presents the whole paradigm of how domestic violence occurs. So, yeah, I think there could be some case for it being sociobiological, if you will.
But then, go ahead, Erin.
But at the end of the day, it simply comes back to sometime in the 21st century, the huge edifice, the multi-million-dollar industry that feeds the radical feminist movement has to be broken up, and the reality and the honesty and the truth is that this generation, it's a problem for both men and women, and at the times the children are horribly abused. Recently, a lot of the cases here in England have been by the mothers doing the abusing, which is why the social services didn't pick it up so quickly. Had it been a man involved, his feet wouldn't have touched the ground. His children, most of them died, but those that will survive, give it 20, 30 years, and when they turn out to be incredibly violent, everybody will hate them. They will forget that when they were 2 or 3, and the pictures in the paper that everybody cried over, this is the likelihood of what would happen to those children.
Well, and I'll give you my own answer as to what I think the biological argument or sociobiological argument might be. You know what? Biologically, it should be perfectly acceptable for me to pee on a tree on a public street, because that's just a perfectly natural impulse, right? We're able to overcome such things with education and training and realizing that we have brains and we can think and not give ourselves over to every impulse to kick somebody in the shins because they made us angry or scream at somebody just because they've gotten in our way. I mean, even if we accept that there's a genetic basis to some of this, the notion that we can't overcome it must surely be questionable as long as we start educating people and making them look at things. That would be my opinion. There I am just pontificating again, but I'm offering it. In any case, you did say something interesting there, Professor Dutton. You said something like 70-80% of your students at this point are female?
Well, in this one graduate class, yes. I mean, I would say in undergraduate classes, it's 2/3 to 1/3.
It's interesting. Dr. Carr Palmatier, who also does, we're going to have her on one of these days, Erin. Dr. Palmatier, who does her work mostly helping male victims in abusive relationships, has come to refer to the social sciences, particular psychology, social work, all that, as she literally uses the phrase estrogen ghetto. She says the male presence in the field is just completely evaporating. Think she's exaggerating there?
There's definitely trends towards a higher percentage of women. I mean, I think that's true. I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to call it an estrogen ghetto. I mean, there still are males, at least in psychology. I would say it's maybe 60% female at graduate school, female.
But in a way, this gives me some hope, because I have an idea that we need women desperately to speak up about these things.
Right.
And if you're finding the young women in your classes who are entering this field are open-minded and not, slamming down their books and...
Let me just say one thing. I mean, what I really notice with women these days, 20-year-old women these days, is they don't have any of these old sort of gender stereotypes that say that they're victims. They just don't believe they're victims. They don't buy that. I mean, they really have a sense, from my talking to them at least, they really do have a sense that they're growing up in an egalitarian society. So they don't buy a lot of this sort of historic notion that was put out by, the gender paradigm people that every woman on the planet is a victim. They don't buy into it.
So one is based on finding, like many young women in England, many young women in England are very confused as to what their future is going to be like, because the whole concept of marriage has now become a very rare institution. And most of these women, particularly when you meet them in their late 30s, are in a state of panic, because they know that they have very little time left to either find a man who will father the children and commit himself to them. And if that doesn't happen for them, they will certainly have the careers that they fought for, which is wonderful. But the future for them is very bleak, which is completely different from men. Men can continue to have children for a great deal of time, whereas women can't. There is a new confusion now as a result of all this disharmony and what I call the gender war. Do you see that?
I do see that. I think there is confusion about a lot of things for young people these days. There's just a real sense of future uncertainty, and things are changing very quickly. So I completely understand where they're coming from with that.
I do too, and I just think it's very strange and hard, because my generation of women, the attitude was we had to reach for male power. So there was this kind of attitude of in-your-face politics. And, a woman's role, you certainly didn't do anything around the house. I mean, the amount of times a woman said to me, I don't do cooking, I don't do housework, and I pay other women to do this for me. That attitude has made it a very hostile place for men to try and create relationships. And you know what's happening? They're not. I mean, this is something that is becoming more and more apparent, that men are actually giving up on the whole concept of a committed relationship. And they can have a completely uncommitted relationship. Certainly in LA, where I'm going, they can have a serial sexual relationships with as many women as they can. Well, and that's a disaster for both men and women.
fact of the matter is that if you create an environment for men in which they are constantly demonized and honestly in, danger of being falsely accused or things like that, it becomes a very dangerous environment for them. It's not just about attitude. It's about you're taking a risk here. You get yourself into a relationship with a borderline personality type woman, etc. You're in trouble. You're kind of guilty until proven innocent. Professor Dutton, weren't you telling me you yourself faced some experience in that area as well?
Yeah, I had a very bad situation with a student that accused me of sexual harassment, and even though subsequently it was revealed that she had committed welfare fraud and defrauded the university, and subsequently she was arrested for immigration fraud. She just had this long history of defrauding every system. And when she saw me, she tried to blackmail me into getting into graduate school, and I told her I couldn't do that, and she proceeded on to try and use a local human rights commission to get some money, which she did. And it just trashed me and my life. I mean, we could go through this whole thing. It was really quite horrific, a real cop play overnight.
And that's going everywhere.
Yeah.
All the time. It's just the tragedy of it.
Now, let's just be clear, because we have our critics to listen to this show. Professor Dutton just confessed to something bad. No, eventually you were basically what you were accused of was felony without merit, right?
Yeah, and he said, that's right, they didn't believe there had been any sexual contact, but they did say I was guilty of sexually harassing her because I had created a sexualized environment, they said. And the way they went about deducing that was the music I played, which, by the way, was an Armenian funeral dirge. Okay, so that was their, I mean, they just shaped everything into their precepts, of course. So that's how it turned out. So there was no sex, but it was a sexualized environment somehow.
Well, this is the same now with this new paranoid rape attitude that's going on. That is culturally, in universities, they can claim that there is a whole rape hostility in the campuses caused by men, even though a man hasn't raped anybody. It's just there.
Mm-hmm.
It's an entity. So a man who's walking across a green lawn is getting off rape 5. Then a lot of students look at each other and said, he looks rapey. That's one of the new words. No, it's yeah.
No, I know. I'm laughing, but ruefully laughing because I know you're correct. We had a great show on this a month or so ago, by the way. If anybody wants to go through our show archives, we had a great show with Philip W. Cook, who recently did a tremendous book called When Women Sexually Assault Men that goes into the sexual assault issue and how much more common it is for women to sexually assault men than anybody wants to hear or wants to believe. Very much like the domestic violence issue. People don't want to believe women sexually assault at a higher rate than the media and the government usually reports. And he's also got solid academic peer-reviewed research behind him. I assume that's not an area of research you get into much, Professor Dutton?
I've read the literature on it. I haven't done research on it myself. And when we did our research on abuse of personality, and we used as criterion measures in this research the reports of wives who were partnered with men that were in a criminal justice system treatment group. And so we asked them all about psychological abuse and sexual abuse and physical abuse. And the reports of sexual abuse in that group were actually so low that it was pointless to even try to report them.
Wow. That's just amazing. Well, I mean, I think the point I was trying to get at earlier, we probably want to start wrapping up the show here in a little bit, but I'm actually really hopeful when I hear that even though there is a growing female, if not dominance, and certainly majority in the psychological field, if these young women coming up are showing themselves able to be open-minded and thoughtful and not reactionary, then, well, I mean, there's this old phrase, I don't remember who said it, was a physicist, Niels Bohr, one of those guys said, science advances one funeral at a time. It may be that there's a great deal of hope coming up in this crop of young researchers, young up-and-coming psychologists who will hear it and will believe it and don't have a vested interest in not believing that the gender paradigm is bunk. The gender paradigm, from all the science I can see, from all the real-world experience I can see, the gender paradigm is nonsense. And we don't have a problem with men's violence toward women. We have a problem with people's violence toward each other.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. And the whole of the gender paradigm actually ends up as a very serious fraudulent use of taxpayers' money to keep this evil empire, as I call it, alive.
I would agree.
Well, excellent. So let's go ahead and start wrapping up the show. Sorry, Al from Atlanta, we didn't get to you. We tried to get to you and you weren't there, but that's all right. We'll be here We'll be here in future episodes. Next Saturday, we are going to have the return of Tales from the Infrared with Kristen Schaffman of Men's Human Rights Ontario. And then 2 weeks from now, we'll, of course, be back. Our guest is going to be, preliminarily, looks like Andrew Harry, who is a well-known men's advocate, and so I think a lot of people will enjoy talking to him. I've also gotten preliminary agreement from a UK-based Swedish researcher named Nicola Graham-Kavan, who's one of those younger psychologists. She's given us preliminary agreement to come on the show, Erin, so we may be talking to her.
She's wonderful.
In the near future. And plenty else going on. So what I'll ask is, Professor Dutton, do you have anything else you'd like to observe or share with us before we end today's program?
I think we pretty much covered the water tank.
All right. Well, I really want to thank you. We were honored to have you on our show. We hope we can have you on again one of these times. Erin, do you have anything else you want to say?
It's lovely to talk to you, Don. And
thank you.
Okay. I'll be in Toronto, and we'll get in touch.
Oh, yeah. We'll hope to see you there in Toronto, sir. All right. Thank you, everybody. Good night and good morning, and have a great weekend. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Okay.
Bye-bye, everybody.
You have been listening to Revelations with Erin Pizzey and her co-host, Dean Esme. Our show's opening music is called Eternal Hope, and the closing piece is called Sunshine. Both pieces are by Kevin MacLeod and are used under the Creative Commons Attribution License, with a link in the show notes. We also wish to thank James Huff and Paul Elam, and indeed all those who are part of the A Voice for Men community for their support for this show. Remember, in truth there is hope and healing, and we hope that you will be part of helping to spread the truth and the healing. Please join us next time in Revelations with Erin Pizzey.